Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Influence of Economy podcast. I'm your host, Shayna Davis. I'm so glad that you're here today. But before we get started, I would love if you would do me a favor. So, wherever it is that you are listening to this message, I want you to take a screenshot. And with that screenshot, I want you to post it on LinkedIn, tag me here at Shayna Rattler Davis. And then I just want to hear your biggest aha moment or your biggest takeaway from this episode. And the reason why I ask you to do that is because, in my opinion, there's just far too many leaders nowadays that don't know how to cultivate the external signals that the new world demands. And so, the more times that these episodes are shared, the more people that will be exposed to the signals that they need to develop in order to be able to lead better. So, I want to thank you in advance for being willing to share. So, I want to talk to you about an experience that I had. I was sitting in a room with 5,000 builders, enterprise leaders, and investors a few weeks ago. And I want to be honest with you about what I actually saw because when I went to Human+Tech Week in San Francisco, that's where I was expecting to spend 5 days in deep conversations about AI, the future of work, the future of cities, the future of health, the future of product development, where technology was headed. And obviously, those things were happening, those conversations were being discussed. But that's not what I kept noticing. What I kept noticing was something that nobody was naming. I was watching founders pitch, and I was also watching leaders take the stage. I was watching people walk into investor conversations and panel discussions and networking rooms full of people who could change the trajectory of their companies. And what I was witnessing, without anyone else probably realizing it, was a live credibility audit. Like that's what I was doing. I was doing a live credibility audit. Thousands of founders being evaluated in real time, but not on what you think, not on their technology, but on their ability to signal that their technology is worth betting on, because those are two very different things. And the gap between those things, that's what this episode is about. So let me tell you what I mean by credibility audit, because I'm not talking about whether or not the people were impressive, because a lot of people in that room from the first day to the last day were genuinely impressive. The deals were real, the ideas were real, the ambition was real, the technology in many cases was extraordinary. But what I'm talking about is something more subtle and more costly. It's the moment when a founder opens their mouth to explain what they've built and the room starts working overtime to figure out what it is that they actually mean. Because I heard one phrase more times than I could care to count, and that's what that really means is. So a founder would lead with something complex, something technical, something that required context in order for it to land. And then after either watching the energies in the room shift around, they'd follow up with the simple version. What that really means is, and I know that that sounds like a small thing, but it's not, because every time a founder has to translate themselves in real time, they are broadcasting something. What they're doing is they're telling the room, I wasn't sure that you could handle the clear version first. Or worse, I wasn't sure that I trusted myself to lead with it. And it's common, especially with technical leaders, for them to lead with things that are a little bit more technical in nature, because after all, like that's what they spent years doing, building the thing and being wired, in a technical way and speaking in technical ways. But here is an analogy that I think puts this in sharp relief. So imagine that you are having a pre-op conversation with a surgeon before hip surgery. Stick with me. Now, when the surgeon is talking to you, do they open with the clinical mechanics, like how you're going to be positioned on the table, the angle of the incision, the specific instruments that are going to be involved? No, probably not. Or do they lead with the outcome? Like after this procedure, you're going to get up and you're going to walk without a limp. You're going to walk without pain. Maybe even after therapy, that's what's going to happen. But you know immediately which one lands, which one builds confidence, which one makes you feel like you're in the right hands. Now, the clinical version, it isn't wrong, but it's the wrong opening. And yet, founders do the equivalent of this constantly. They lead with the architecture, the infrastructure, the methodology, the technical differentiation, and the room, whether it's made up of investors, potential partners, the press, maybe it's somebody that's considering coming to work for you. They're sitting there waiting on one answer. What changes for me after this? What does the world look like on the other side of what you're building? Because the market doesn't fund your process, it funds the future that you're promising. And here's the truth about that: the clearest voice in any room is almost always the credible one. I'm going to say that again. The clearest voice in any room is almost always the most credible one. Not the most technical voice, not the most sophisticated voice, the clearest. And you don't diminish your credibility by making something easy to understand, you earn it. And the founders who understood that in San Francisco recently, they didn't have to say what that really means is. You know why? Because they started there. But outcome blind communication was only part of what I was watching that week. The bigger pattern, the one that follows you long after the event ends, was this: founders are spit, or let me say, how do I say this? Founders are spending trust without knowing it. And most of them, they have no idea that their account is overdrawn. Now, here's what I mean by that: trust isn't built in a single moment. It's not built in a pitch. It's not built in a keynote. It's not built in one strong LinkedIn post or one well placed media mention. Trust is built in accumulated signals over time. And it also erodes the same way: slowly, quietly, often invisibly. And I heard at least three people in that room acknowledge almost casually that once trust is gone, it's nearly impossible to recover. And they said it like it was a fact about other people, not a warning about themselves. But here's what I want you to sit with. By the time a founder notices that trust is gone with an investor, with a key hire, or with a market segment that they thought they owned, the withdrawal has already happened. It happened over dozens of small moments of inconsistent messaging, absence from the right conversations, a public signal that didn't land the way they intended, an investor call where the story shifted slightly from the last one. Maybe it was even a LinkedIn page that hasn't been touched in 8 months, or a leadership team that's never been seen anywhere except internally. Each one of those individually looks like nothing, but collectively, they are actually a trust ledger. And most founders have never audited that trust ledger. So let me give you a framework for thinking about this, because I don't want you leaving this episode with a vague discomfort about credibility. I want you leaving with something that you can actually use. So think about the last 90 days of your external signals, not your internal operations, not your product roadmap, not your team meetings, your external signals. What did you say publicly? Where did you show up? Where were you conspicuously absent? What did investors, potential hires, and market observers hear from you? And what did your silence tell them? Because that's your trust ledger. And I want you to take that seriously, because most founders treat external presence like a campaign, like something you turn on when you need it. Because a fundraise is coming up, you start posting. A product launch, you book the podcast interviews. An award submission, suddenly everyone has a bio. And then the moment passes and the presence disappears. And that's not how trust compounds. What you're actually doing when you operate that way is signaling inconsistency to the exact people you're trying to impress. Investors who were watching your space 3 months ago, they noticed that you were absent. Your next key hire was looking at your LinkedIn the week you weren't posting. The journalists covering your category, they used a competitor as a source because you weren't visible when the story was being written. And none of those moments showed up on your radar. But all of them affected your trust ledger. Most founders, they don't even look at that ledger until it's too late. They don't look at it until something breaks. Maybe that's a round that takes longer than expected. A key hire chooses a competitor to go work for them instead of you. or a category conversation happens in the press and your company isn't mentioned. And then there's a scramble trying to figure it out. There's a rush to produce content, to produce booking, speaking engagements, to suddenly be visible everywhere at once. And it doesn't land because trust doesn't work that way. You can't sprint your way back to credibility. You build it consistently or you lose it quietly. Now, here's where I want to pull back and talk about what's actually happening in that room at a macro level. Because the individual patterns that I just described, those outcome blind communication, the trust ledger that nobody's auditing, those aren't random. They're symptoms of something larger. The technology conversation is happening at scale. 5,000 builders in one room is at Human+Tech Week is proof of that. But the investment in AI, the development of new products, the ambition behind what's being built, that part is loud. But the conversation credibility, but the leadership credibility conversation, unfortunately, that's what's lagging. And I don't mean that as a criticism of the founders in that room. I mean it as an observation about where the field is right now. We are in a moment where the quality of what you build is no longer the primary differentiator. And I know some of you probably just bristled at that, so bear with me because I'm not saying that the technology doesn't matter because it does. What I'm saying is that in a market this crowded, where AI capabilities are accelerating faster than any one company can sustain a lead, the technology is increasingly table stakes. Like that's the bare minimum. Have investors tell me all the time, like, we're not even investing in the technology. We're investing in the team and the brains behind it because all the technology opportunities that come our way this time that are fascinating. They're all great. But what distinguishes the companies that break through from the ones that plateau, how credibly the people behind the technology can signal its value. That's what's distinguishing them. To investors who are choosing where to put capital, to talent who are choosing where to put their careers, to markets that are deciding who gets to define the category, that's not a soft skill. That's a commercial outcome. And I want to be specific about what credible signaling actually looks like because be more visible is not an answer. Visibility without substance is just noise. So this is not about posting more. There are founders who are everywhere, podcasts, panels, LinkedIn posts every day, and investors still aren't buying because the signal is high volume and low credibility. What actually moves the needle is this: being clear about what you stand for before anyone asks. What also helps to move the needle is having a point of view that's distinct enough that people know how to place you in the landscape. Communicating outcomes, not processes, not features, not technical architecture, but outcomes. Like what changes for the customer, what the market looks like after your solution exists, what problem disappears and what problem becomes possible, or what actually does become possible because it does. That's what investors fund, not your process, but the future that you're promising. And if you can't articulate that future consistently, credibly, and clearly across every external touch point, your pitch deck isn't your problem. Your credibility signal is. Let me tell you what the founders who stood out to me that week, what they were doing differently. They were leading with outcomes, not we built a platform that does X, but after working with us, this specific thing changes for your organization. They weren't explaining what the product does. They were painting a picture of what becomes true. And the difference in how the room responded was unmistakable because one framing creates curiosity and the other creates comprehension. And in a room full of investors and decision makers who have heard hundreds of pitches, comprehension is a gift. They were also consistent. The story on stage matched the story in the hallway, matched the story in the investor conversation. No version drift, no real time translation, no what I really mean is. When your story is that stable, people don't have to recalibrate every time they encounter you. They already know who you are and what you're building. That consistency builds a kind of cognitive shortcut in the minds of the people that you most need to reach. They see you and they already have a frame for you. And that's not charisma, that's clarity. Practice over time until it becomes automatic. And they were present, not just at the event, in the market, before the event. They walked into rooms where people already had context for them. That context didn't appear on the day of the conference, it was built deliberately over time before anyone told them this conference was worth attending. That's the trust ledger working in your favor. And that's the version most founders haven't built yet because they're still treating credibility as something that happens in the room instead of something that arrives before you do. Here's the question I want you to take away from this, not how do I get more visible? Instead, ask yourself this. If the investors, hires, and market observers you most want to reach looked at your last 90 days of external signals, what would they conclude about you? Would they see a founder who has a clear, consistent point of view? Or would they see someone who shows up when they need something and goes quietly in between? Would they see a leadership team that collectively signals credibility? Or a single founder carrying all the external weight with the rest of the team invisible to the outside world? Would they see communication that leads with outcomes and speaks directly to what changes? Or communication that requires them to do extra work to figure out what you actually need? And here's the one that most founders avoid. Would they see a trust ledger that's been actively managed or one that's been ignored and is quietly compounding against you? These are not comfortable questions. I get that, but they're the right ones because here's the thing about Human Tech Week that no one said out loud. The technology conversation is happening. The ambition is real, the builders are serious, but the credibility conversation is lagging. And in a market that is moving this fast, in a funding environment that is this selective, in a talent war this competitive, the gap between what you're building and how credibly you can signal it is where categories get lost. So if this landed for you, here's what I want you to do. Pull up your external presence. LinkedIn, speaking history, media mentions, what you've published, where you've shown up, and run the 90-day audit. Not from your perspective, but from the perspective of someone who doesn't know you yet. What do they conclude? Because that conclusion is already forming. You just don't get to hear it in real time. So if you want to go deeper on this, connect with me on LinkedIn. I read all of my messages personally. That's where I'm continuing this conversation and sharing what I'm seeing on the ground with founders and leadership teams that are navigating exactly this. And if this episode shifted how you're thinking about the credibility side of your business, share it with a founder who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I hope that you'll go back and listen to future and previous episodes as well, because every week on the influence economy, we're getting into the real dynamics behind how leaders are perceived, how trust is built, and how credibility becomes a competitive advantage. I hope to see you again soon. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.